Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Dimple Patel, and I am one of the board members for AFSP Illinois and one of the co-chairs for the DEI committee. And we wanted to say thank you so much for being here with us tonight and spending your evening with us as well. And so just to give you a little bit of a background of our AFSP Illinois DEI committee, we are dedicated to increasing awareness, representation, and fairness to create a safe and welcoming space that fosters meaningful change and reflects the communities that we serve and are a part of. Disparities in access to care and treatment are among many of the diverse challenges that many of us face, especially when managing mental health issues. And addressing these inequalities is essential to discussing mental health, especially within marginalized communities, which is why we are here today. So on behalf of AFSP and the DEI committee, thank you so much for joining us. And if you have any questions for the panelists or myself, please feel free to type them in the chat box or the question box, and we will get to them. And we will also be providing resources that will be emailed out. So with that being said, I would like to introduce you to our panelists, starting off with Luma.
Hey everyone, my name is Luma Bonilla Webster. My pronouns are she, her, or ella. También hablo español. And I'm here today to support the panel on the topic of immigrant rights and immigrant health.
Thank you, Luma. And going next to Anne.
Hi, my name is Ann King. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am on the board of directors for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and I am on the board for Project Sun, which helps families navigate the system of care. And I also work as their family liaison. And I will also be talking a little bit about 988 tonight.
Thank you, Anne. And going next to Dr. Padipati.
Thank you so much, Dimple. My name is Dr. Cynthia Padipati. Currently, I'm a clinical assistant professor at Loyola University Chicago. I was also in my previous life a pediatric oncology nurse, and then I also became a pediatric mental health nurse practitioner. I specialized working with children, families, and adolescents. So I'm also here to talk a little bit more about children and teens and their families. And I'm also a current board member of the Illinois Foundation for Suicide, or the Illinois Foundation for the Illinois chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. And next we are going to go to Tammy.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Tammy Bush, and I am a board member with AFSP. I am also a program manager for the GEO group. I work with ex-offenders. I've been doing that about 30 plus years. And I am excited about being here tonight. And I am here going to be talking a little bit more about Let's Save Lives, what affects the, how suicide affects the Black community. Thank you.
Thank you. And then to end with Matt.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Heading-Hess. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a therapist at Rise and Thrive Wellness in Kankakee, Illinois, as well as the co-founder and president of the Kankakee Area LGBTQ Network. And I'll be kind of talking about LGBTQ communities today.
All right, thank you. And so now we're going to just dive into our questions. And the first question that we have for you is, what are some of the biggest barriers that marginalized communities face when seeking mental health support, and how can we begin to dismantle these barriers?
Good. Okay. I'll get us started tonight. One of the things that I think that affect the Black community, the marginalized communities is systemic racism and injustices. And when we're talking about systemic racism, we're looking at mass incarceration. And we see that when it comes to the injustices, we can see how that perpetrates cycles of, I would say, stress, for not only just for individuals, but for communities as well. And then we also need to look at historical mistrust, racial segregation, discrimination, police brutality, and also racial profiling are some of the things that we need to look at as well. And this bring about minority stress when we're dealing with a lot of those things. You got the microaggressions. You hear a lot about that now. Discrimination and prejudice, things that, that people face. And this causes a lot of chronic stress and anxiety for people. And it's due to their minority status. And when they think about being isolated and things like that come into play. Lack of awareness information out there for the Black community. And so I'm excited about the fact that AFSP has put out specific training, like Let's Save Lives, and another one will be Soul Shop for Black churches. And then we have to look at the mental health stigma that plays into part, and that's due to cultural norms and mistrust for the healthcare systems. So those are some of the things that I believe that would come into play when we're looking at that.
Thank you, Tammy. And speaking of Let's Save Lives and Soul Shop, I'm going to jump in with Luma. She's also our programs manager at AFSP Illinois. So if there is anybody that's interested in any programming or anything, please also contact her. But Luma, did you want to also jump into question?
So with regards to like immigrant health and any sort of cultural, well, just general barriers, there's some intersections with what Tammy mentioned, but also there's more economic barriers. Again, and also another intersection, limited access to like providers that can actually have some connection to the stories that we share. Because when you're a migrant, asylum, a refugee, your reasons for traveling usually involved fleeing violence or economic issues and disparity, which that in and of itself already causes trauma and other issues at home. But that then becomes compounded with travel, with prejudice, with other issues, so that when assuming, let's say that you are an asylee, let's say, since because it's a legally protected status, you have to, as part of the legal immigration process, retell and relive your story multiple times. So every time you're in court proceedings, every time you speak to a lawyer, and then that story has to become validated. So then it's questioned, it's picked apart. So there's a lot of PTSD and trauma that comes with that part, just aside from the travel, right? So that providing or finding connection to someone who understands that sorts of stories can become a big barrier for people who might recognize that they even need assistance with mental health issues, because lots of times there's this, cultural stigma that seeking mental health is not something that we normally do because it's a sign of weakness, or it's a personal failing, or personally that something's wrong with you, or that you're just lazy, or that you just need to be stronger and you need to try harder, right? Because a lot of times in our populations, we have this idea if we just work harder, things become better. So there's a lot of that some cultural beliefs that kind of go into that can be barriers for immigrant populations. And then also just general language and communication barriers, the lack of access to providers who speak the many different immigrant languages. Oftentimes, and I'll just speak for like Latina community members, but even within this, we speak, lots of indigenous languages, not just Spanish. So finding providers that can speak those languages fluently to be able to provide those services can become really difficult for immigrant population people. And then I'll also add again that the being able to have that awareness that there even is a mental health issue. There isn't that connection necessarily. Sometimes we rely a lot in our communities on what we call like our cultural healers if we have problems with physical health, but we don't always associate our mental health as that being an issue that needs to be addressed as well. So those are some of the things that come up a lot for migrant and immigrant communities.
And adding to that too, Luma, it's like one of the discussions that we had last week was also the difference in like first generation and immigrant individuals, and also being raised here, but then also still bringing your cultural values and traditions, and how parents might see certain things differently, or how my dad says, "What do you know about stress?" I'm like, "Oh my God, okay." But it's also like that part too of, go either seeking support in secret or finding at low cost. And universities are a great place too for either international or immigrant students to find support at low cost.
Yeah, it's also true that there's, even within the migrant community, there's different like levels. So like, for example, first generation people, or even like myself. So when my family came here, I was about a year old. You could say, I've lived my entire life in the US, but at the same time, I had a very strong cultural connection to that Mexican side of my family. I wasn't really raised in American culture. So there were certain barriers that I had to deal with that. Also, the extreme need to sort of be fitting into American culture. So being, a good worker, having a job, getting an education, all of these things can become a lot of pressures for first generation people. Going to school, making sure you graduate, all of these different things that can affect our mental health as well. Those become problems. And then there's also for people who are American born children of immigrant parents, having that like dichotomy of being part of two different cultures, right? And I kind of bring that a little bit into some of what I do as well. But that as an example, maybe you were raised here and you went to American schools, or you're born here, you went to American schools, and your parents encouraged you only speaking English because they wanted to associate versus speaking Spanish. So then you lose that Spanish part of your language, but yet if you have the capacity to, traveling or going back to Mexico, or even just within our own communities, then you become ostracized because you don't speak Spanish. So there's a lot of these different stigmas and things that we have to deal with within the immigrant community. Lots of people don't think about that can also be barriers for access to mental health care too.
And just before we go to Matt on this, Luma and I are planning, are in the talks of having a discussion of panel around immigrant rights and immigrant individuals and suicide prevention. So that will be coming in the future. And jumping to Matt.
Yeah, thanks. So in addition to the kind of basic barriers to mental health treatment, things like lack of affordability or insurance to be able to receive treatment, transportation. I live in a rural sort of community, so a lot of people don't have access to a therapist that's, in drivable distance. A lot of LGBTQ people specifically have what I find is have a hard time finding a therapist who they find competent in the culture and understanding of what it might be to be LGBTQ. And so that can definitely be a difficulty. A lot of people want to see a queer therapist, which can be hard in certain areas of the state as well. Fear of being outed, I think that's a big thing in our social political landscape right now. It's a difficult place to be queer openly. And so when people come to therapy, they, even to be able to receive treatment, they may feel like they have to come out or share that, especially young people, to be able to receive treatment. And another thing that came to mind too is not being able to be taken seriously. We think about that a lot with young people, especially in the social political landscape. But I've had clients come to me who come out to a therapist, and the therapist says, the client says, I'm trans, and then the therapist responds, no, you're not. Those sort of things happen all the time, and it's just kind of the political landscape we live in, I think. But being taken seriously too, I think those are all barriers for LGBTQ folks specifically.
And thank you, Matt. I like also with that too, there's going to be a question later on with this that I will jump back to you on, because I think you hit a lot of great points on that in terms of like resources, but related to telehealth. So I will come back to you on that one. Going to like our next question, I wanted to talk a little bit more about specific populations and what are some unique challenges that Black individuals face when it comes to mental health and suicide prevention. And wanted to go to Tammy.
When we look at this, we see a lack of representation. It could either be in education, in government, even a lack of role models representing Black individuals, fewer Black mental health professionals, in which all of these things can lead to mistrust and that disconnect that we have. Racial trauma is one of the things that we see, and this has led to increase in PTSD. And you can look at a lot of people are talking about now depression, anxiety that they're facing. So we also look at cultural stigmas that we see when it comes to this. And there's also what I've seen also is a lack of access to treatment. We see for us in this particular population, and then also a lack of insurance, being able to get that medical care that we need. And also most Black people want to, when they go to seek mental health, we want somebody that kind of look like us, that can relate to us, and to be able to share it. And there's a lack of that in our community. So I see those are some of the unique challenges that we face.
Sorry, okay, I forget. I was muted. Apologize for that in advance. But I actually wanted to bring Anne in with us, as she has been a 988 crisis chat counselor, and ask Anne about like her experience with 988 and anything that she has come across that could help us with this.
Oh, thank you. And I had a good 2 years where I worked with 988, and I worked either on the text line, and I also worked on the LGBTQ call line. And I want to share, it is such a safe place to reach out and talk to someone. You do not have to be suicidal. If you just need to talk to someone, it is a very safe place to call. We're not going to call the police. We're not going to send anyone to your home. If you're just looking for someone to have conversation with, to be seen and be heard, that is the place that you're able to do that, whether you chat, text, call. I really, really enjoyed working on the LGBTQ line. It was a place where, being an ally, I could be there and I could help youth navigate conversations of how they're going to talk to family or teachers, give them resources. So it's not just a conversation, it's getting resources. We offer follow-ups, and there's lots of opportunities when you call 988.
Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing that. I really wanted to also highlight that aspect as well, because there is that fear of, oftentimes with marginalized communities, that, okay, if they call 911 and there's been so many times that it hasn't gone well, or the right support hasn't been provided, and that fear of, well, what happens if that happens with 988? How has 988 navigated that?
That is absolutely the last thing we want to do, is call law enforcement, because most law enforcement aren't trained to de-escalate a crisis like a 988 counselor is. So if someone, is needing help and requesting it, we get consent from them, and we actually do a warm transfer where I would stay on the line with the person, and we would transfer them to the local mobile crisis near them. And they would have a conversation set up to have mobile crisis come to them, and it doesn't even have to be their home. They can meet at, McDonald's down the street, and they can have that conversation and find the resources they need. And if they need to get assistance to get inpatient care, they can help them with that.
Great. And I wouldn't be, if I could just jump in real quick too, related to 988. So thank you so much, Anne. And just to also kind of bring it back to what Tammy was saying. So over the summer, I got to attend the Black Youth Suicide Policy Academy in Bethesda, Maryland. And so the Illinois group, we got together, we were talking. And so we're talking about 988 and how beneficial it can be, especially for Black and African-American communities, because sometimes, again, getting law enforcement involved can be even more traumatic or just as traumatic as the actual incident that might be going on. So 988 can often be a safer option, especially for people, again, who have a significant mistrust for good reason, right? With the police, with any sort of law enforcement. So 988 is a great option, viable option, alternative. So I just wanted to add that too, and just kind of connect that also with what Tammy was talking about, the kind of mistrust, the abuses in medicine and healthcare that Black and African American communities have been subjected to over the years.
Thank you so much. And jumping on to like your next question too, segueing into the Latinx and immigrant community, I want to refer back to Luma, and this is a question we have of the Latinx community and immigrants also experience a lack of mental health support. And you've briefly already touched on this too, but can you talk about some of the healthcare disparities that are unique to them? And do you also notice that individuals might go to like primary care providers with either physical symptoms or displaying that, or is there a fear of even just saying that or that being associated with any mental health issues?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that come. So specifically for like mental health disparities for the immigrant community, again, we talked about PTSD and trauma, also child separation. We're sending a lot of youth on their own to travel to migrate to the US. The immigration process, I think, should be probably added as part of the mental health disparity, because just that whole legal process causes a lot of trauma for people. Still that fear, lack of insurance and language barriers. But also, yeah, again, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes people don't, and this probably just goes also back to like general population, where we sometimes don't recognize physical symptoms as being something that is actually tied to a mental health condition. And that happens a lot for our communities too. Another thing that might cause some issues for people is, getting access to medical care, and then having a medical mental health diagnosis. If that gets added to your legal case, it can have both negative and positive implications depending on, how your case is looking. So that's another thing to kind of look at. I think the good news, this kind of varies per state, but in Illinois we have some safeguards and coverage for people who are immigrants or are even undocumented. We have Medicaid specifically for immigrant seniors that people can use that covers their mental health care. And there's lots of other organizations in the state who provide some mental health coverage either at low cost or no cost. Obviously, this also kind of varies. There's more coverage in more populated, bigger cities than there is in rural areas, even though the migrant population in Illinois is pretty dispersed because we are more like a Midwest farming type of state, right? So it kind of depends. But yeah, so in terms of like just unique mental health disparities, again, some prolonged stress, PTSD, and then just thinking about the prolonged stress portion of it, sometimes if you're in legal proceedings, it might take years before you can get proper documentation so you can actually get a job with a social security number. If you're an asylee, sometimes it just takes a couple of months, but even that, what do you do in the meantime, right? You still need to feed yourself, still need to feed your family, still need to clothe yourself, still need to have housing. And so all of that kind of compounded stress can be a problem for people that they have to deal with as well. So there's lots and lots of different things that affect the immigrant community specifically.
Thank you so much, Luma. I agree with a lot of what you have said and come across that with clinically or just in the community that I live in as well. And it's also helpful to understand that too, with everything that might be changing, changes coming along. And even as clinicians, like how can we support all of these communities and be able to even just take that information in and apply it to the individuals that we work with. And going on to like our next question too, I wanted to ask about what research shows that within the LGBTQ community that individuals are more likely to experience mental health challenges than individuals that are not within the LGBTQ plus community? And can you talk about some of these unique challenges that they face?
Sure. So I just got some stats written down because I'm not a stats man for sure. But LGBTQ people are twice as likely to have a mental health disorder in their lifetime. They're 2.5 times more likely to experience depression and anxiety than heterosexual people. We're just at increased rates, and you can kind of imagine a lot of those things are due to minority stress. And I mean, if you're a queer person watching the news right now, you can imagine the anxiety and stress that causes right now. And so we're really at LGBTQ folks are at an increased risk of mental health difficulties, suicidality, even things as far as like other things that can contribute to mental health struggles, homelessness. We're at a much higher risk of homelessness, all those sorts of things. Sorry, hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And also of going into this part too of like, how can individuals, it's even within the community, but also neighbors, teachers, other therapists, or even just anybody or friends too at school, how can we increase support that beyond what's already out there? Or if someone's worried about a friend or somebody that they might know, what are ways that they can approach them or identify, hey, are you struggling, or what is the best approach to take?
Yeah, I'll kind of break it down in sections. I know you talked about community members, for example, first. I know that one of the ways that the network that I'm part of exists is as kind of a community referral source. Like one of the things that we do a lot of is connecting people to folks that other queer people have had good experiences with. So there's lots of like, oh, I saw this therapist or this medical doctor, and they were a safe person and had a good experience with them. I think that's really important to be able to refer to safe people and receive quality and competent care. As far as other mental health professionals, this is something I really struggle with because as I mentioned earlier, other therapists kind of having really harmful interactions with clients, and then I hear about that either when they reach me or as part of the LGBTQ network. One of the things that I started doing was having a consultation group and invited other local therapists to be a part of it. I think that we have to educate each other and kind of have some conversations. So I facilitate that monthly. And that's been really helpful for me, at least, to feel like I'm doing something. There's something I can do to kind of increase the competence and understanding of the community, the mental health community here locally, to be a part of that. But otherwise, I mean, as other organizations, increasing your representation on your social media and your websites. I know it's as little as putting a rainbow sticker on your door when people walk in. Those things do, obviously that shouldn't be the only thing you do, but those things are really important to let people know that you're a safe location and that you're welcoming to LGBTQ folks. It really isn't helpful for even myself. And then just being able to be knowledgeable about other resources, right? So connecting people with other things that they may need to kind of outside of their mental health care too, right? Like we connect people with gender affirming care and safe primary care physicians to provide that, community support organizations, social support. The network does monthly meetups like coffee and a teen group and 50 plus group. We do lots of different things like that just to kind of bolster the community support. And so we find that is really important to kind of benefiting the mental health of the community as well. Just after the election, we had a town hall where we have generally small groups of people that come out for most of our events, but our town hall had over 100 people that showed up to a week after the election, and that's because we're all kind of feeling the stress of what is maybe coming in the next 4 years. And so it was really powerful to be in the room where people can kind of talk openly about like how we can support each other and what we can do as far as social support for one another. So I think that's really important too, just kind of being there for each other.
Thank you, Matt. And is that virtual or is that in person? Or do I remember from the past of, is there a Facebook group for individuals? And if there is anything, would you mind if you can like share it in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. We do most of our meetups and things like that in person. But when possible, we do things virtually, and we do have an online like Facebook group that's private for us to do some of that referring and networking and sharing resources. So hopefully
And
more.
allies can be a part of that too. They go through the process, and I want to brag on Matt and the network because they created early this spring, was it, the affirming businesses. So they created a sticker, and businesses within the community can go through the application process and have a nice looking cling. Might be where I work right now, that when you come into our office at Project Sun, you know that we're an affirming business and we will be there to support you. So I love seeing those stickers everywhere in the community, and I'll do my part to help other organizations be a part of it. But I thought that was a great idea as a way to support the LGBTQ community.
And I would just add about that directory, when people receive that cling, they have to sign a pledge, and that pledge just isn't that we're going to affirm LGBTQ people, but there's also an anti-racism clause or part, a land use clause. There's all kinds of other things that kind of hone in our values. And like when you're saying you're a safe and affirming business, you don't just mean for queer people, but like for everybody.
Thank you so much. And we will share a lot of these resources. So if you miss it through the chat, we'll make sure that we also include it in our resource follow-up email. And jumping on to our next question, segueing into children and adolescents, which I've done a lot of my training in. So Cynthia, you're right up my alley on this. But going in, with children and adolescents from within my marginalized communities, there's often the most valuable to the impact of social media, detriments, and how it impacts mental health in general. And as they are in a critical developmental stage with just the constant access, even in school, outside of school, especially within their developmental stage where their physical, mental, and cognitive development is highly sensitive to the environment factors like poverty or lack of access to quality health care, or poor nutrition, or unstable housing, or exposure to stress. And touching on what like Luma had said, even Tammy and Matt, of just the exposure to stress and ongoing stress that's not just at school, but even outside of school. So my question is, what strategies do you have or recommend for children and teens experiencing mental health symptoms, and maybe even for parents too, if you want to add that in, or what would you recommend?
Absolutely. And sometimes when I talk to people, especially because I can't see all your faces on the webinar, I do like to share a little bit of my background and story about how I came into this work. So as I alluded to, I was a pediatric oncology nurse, loved it. I always knew I wanted to work in peds. But then when I went back to my graduate studies, I was at first thinking about like psychosocial aspects with kids with cancer and how that impacts their families. So I transitioned into a mental health nurse practitioner program. And so again, at first I thought I was going to go out there and do psycho-oncology. But once I realized and got out into the mental health care field, especially with children and adolescents, I realized there's so much work to be done. And there's so many resources that get poured into other like medical conditions like cancer, as they should be, but not as many resources and information and just the investment, right, in the mental health care system. And so my first job after my master's program, becoming a psych NP, was out in Camden, New Jersey. So I was out on the East Coast. And so I worked in an intensive residential program with kids kind of in older kids and adolescents in the community. All of them had intense trauma, right? And many of them were from racialized or minoritized communities. And just the amount of, like you said, like toxic, like stress or environments or trauma that impacted them. And so that was an area that really kind of opened my eyes to how much more we need to do for our youth. And after I worked there, I worked at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that also brought kids from all over, right? From Philadelphia, but also the suburbs. And so I learned a lot, especially with working with all different families, all different kids. So what I started doing is really recommending like kids or teens developing like a coping toolkit. And so, and again, what coping mechanisms work for different kids are different, for everybody. But just starting to get kids to think about, what works for them, what things can they do? But also as providers, we also want to make sure that, things like, going out and getting exercise, but like, what if you live in a neighborhood where it's not safe to go outside? Or what if you don't have access, right, to an environment that's safe? So really trying to kind of partner with kids. I always like working with kids, speaking to them on a developmental level, but really engaging them as a partner in care, and families as well. So kind of developing this coping toolkit, whatever works for you. So we can have things like, if kids like to journal or do artwork, other kids need to kind of physically kind of move around, and whether it's exercise, sports, obviously things like deep breathing, yoga, meditation, some of those things, relate to some people, some not, dancing, all sorts of things. So as I start to work with kids and adolescents, we'll try to put that toolkit together. And then the next question too that you asked, Dimple, is how can parents get involved? And so one of the things I learned, I remember my graduates program that I'll never forget, is that this gentleman named Ken Ginsberg said that, for every child or adolescent, if there's just at least one caring adult in their lives, it can literally change their lives or save their lives, as we're talking about suicide prevention. So, whether it's a parent, but also as kids, again, as Matt alluded to, folks in the LGBTQ plus community may not have a parent that they feel close to or trust to. Again, other people in kind of racialized or ethnically diverse families may not feel comfortable sharing that they're having mental health struggles, just because, again, culturally it's been kind of taboo. We don't talk about it. So if it's a parent or extended family member, or maybe, again, it's a teacher, it's a coach, a nurse at the school, a counselor. So really kind of creating an environment of trust where kids feel like that they can open up and trust you and share with you what's going on. So I think that's the number one, is creating kind of really caring, supportive environment. Like Matt said, sometimes these kids get the bravery to open up, to share kind of a vulnerable part of their life, and then they're dismissed. So as adults, I think many of us, I imagine, are adults on the panel. So if we ever have a child or teen that comes to us that wants to share what's going on with them, their mental health concerns, if they're really sad or really angry, or if this experience happened, right? If they're experiencing racial discrimination or discrimination of any kind, right? We don't want to kind of sweep it under the rug. We want to validate their experiences, and really kind of move them to the next steps. I chatted a lot, so I'll see if anyone wants to jump in to add more into
I'll
that.
jump in real quick to kind of follow up on that too. Even in a therapeutic setting too, I've always asked about pronouns, or also how their family dynamic is, how if they go by a different name, or what name that they want me to refer to them, but also in front of parents, and how can I be supportive as a therapist for them. And also, as you mentioned, that trusted adult, it might not always be a parent, but it could be, as many of you have said on here, it could be a therapist, it could be a teacher, it could be a counselor, and that interaction is so important that they feel that connection and safety to be able to come out and share that with you, and providing that resources. And so within that, starting off the bat of creating that safe space, and working with them, but also how, especially going over confidentiality. There's that fear of are you going to tell my parents this? And especially, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but at 12, there's certain confidential aspects that you have up until 18 and stuff. So that's also an important factor to bring in as well, and go over that, especially within the first session too. And I do that in front of both the child or the teen and parents, so they're both on the same page. But I know that Anne wanted to jump in too. as well as Tammy. So I'll just hand it over to you guys.
All right. Well, I wanted to jump in because I am a parent of a child who's been on a lived experience journey. He's an adult now, and I'm very proud of the successes he has made. But I think, you know, there's some very scary times when you're going through that journey. And as a parent, you need to give yourself grace that this is a new ground that you're working and learning. It doesn't come into the what to expect when you're expecting book of having a child with suicidal thoughts. But I think as a parent, the most important thing is active communication, active listening. If either of my children are going to talk to me and open up to me, the phone is gone, there's no smartwatch, there's nothing. It's just straight communication. Find the places that are best to talk. For us, it was always in the car when we were going places. We had wonderful conversations. So find those places. Practice the scary questions by yourself. So then when you have the opportunity and you need to ask those questions, because they may happen. So are you having thoughts of suicide? Do you have a plan? That you can be cool as a cucumber. I always say, like the duck floating on the pond. I can be totally freaking out inside, but my kid knows mom has this. Mom's got my back, and she's going to sit with me in the ER however many hours it takes to keep me safe. So super important things to do. And what really helped me myself as a parent, besides knowing the signs and symptoms and doing things like Talk Saves Lives, mental health first aid, was finding my people, finding family support groups like through NAMI. The LGBTQ network here in Kankakee has a family support group where families can meet. Find your people who understand and are on the journey and have them there to support you, because that's the most important thing, is that support.
And quick, going into, I just want to quick before Tammy jumps in, Luma, could you quickly just, I know you do a lot of work within your community based out in where you live too. If there are, oh my God, I'm blanking on the name right now, but you have shared, I think it's in the resource link, right, of any of like the supports that are available for families. For immigrant parents and for navigating, sorry, I was like, forgot to add that, but with families and parents, and especially with first generation, or if they've come here, or any migrants, what we can do.
One, if you're unsure and know someone who's in like the immigration process, or even if they're undocumented and don't really know where to start, there's two resources that are or can potentially be really helpful. The first one is ICERTS, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. They have a large network to lawyers and information and advocacy for immigrant rights in Illinois, but they also have a really robust connection to other mental health clinics and clinicians across the state. So those are, or that's a really good place to start if you're really not sure, but you also know that you're helping someone who may potentially need immigrant resources. The other one is one that is actually trying to create more of a solid network of immigrant resources across the state, and it's the Coalition for Immigrant Health. They already have some really cool resources on there. When I reached out to them, they were verifying some of them still because they have resources up from like 23, so it's already about a year old. But they're building a supportive network of both clinicians and other services that service the immigrant and undocumented community specifically. And also, particularly for parents, because if you're navigating the process as well, it can be difficult, not just for you, but for the entire family and children. I'll kind of side note, but like and I guess also just kind of coming back to what we're waiting for in the upcoming year with the new administration, especially since it's already been noted that Chicago, or at least the state of Illinois, is going to be one of the first few places that is going to be affected by potential ICE raids, is the fact that we have had instances where family members are detained while children are in school. And so they come home to empty houses or empty apartments. And so it's important to make sure that if you have connections to these children, that they're actually getting the mental health support that they need, but also that if you do know immigrant families or people in your vicinity that you're friends with or that you support, that they're making a family plan right now that includes mental health supports in case anything happens.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I guess I can add a little bit to the conversation. In terms of the Black community, I always think back to being a kid growing up into church. And I think we need to get back to having those conversations because it's a stigma in the Black community. I never really heard anybody talk about mental health. Being a suicide loss survivor, I lost my daughter 10 years ago to suicide. And as I think back, I don't even recall myself even really talking about mental health or even suicide at the dinner table, just starting those conversations at home with your children, getting at the table after school and talking about, what's going on with them, how they're feeling, asking those questions and things like that. And I think because the church is a big part of the African American community. And I love the fact that they have the soul shop now, getting in there, having those conversations, training pastors, leaders, counselors, and things like that in the schools, working with after school programs, the support groups. Ann talked about the support groups. They have what they call parent cafes, restorative justice circles. Being, working in the criminal justice field, suicide was a big, you heard them say that the residents all the time, so getting that training done there. Also, like the after school programs, mentoring programs, just training, having those conversations in those particular settings, I think would help a lot. For us to be able to get the word out about mental health and suicide prevention.
Thank you,
Tammy,
Tam.
thank you. Can I just ask you a question,
Yes.
Tam? So also what I've heard too is like, again, in certain communities, like the Black community that you're talking about too, that this next generation or even your generation, that's kind of like almost like breaking the silence about talking about mental health. Is it also kind of like breaking multi-generational cycles of like trauma or like kind of breaking through that barrier? I don't know if you're experiencing that in your personal life or in your professional life, but I was just curious about that.
Yes, definitely in my professional career, I work with youth right now, and you see that a lot of trauma these kids have faced. We're starting to do what they call trauma-informed care training for our staff, cultural competency training for our staff, just so that when these kids come in with questions or even faced with a lot of things that they have going on, we can then have those real conversations with them and also be able to bring their parents in and to help them as well. So we are doing a lot better in that area by providing that training for our staff and even people in the field that I'm in corrections. So they're doing a lot better in doing that training and stuff. So you are absolutely correct.
Thank
And
you,
I
Tam.
want to jump into, thank you, Cynthia, Tammy, you can start with this too, but if anybody also wants to jump into where there is still that stigma surrounding men's mental health or adolescent teen boys or children, and normalizing mental health within all aspects from boys to teenagers to men. And how can we approach that, or how can we kind of navigate that area and have you worked with any individuals or come across this within your communities, and how have you approached it, and what can others take steps towards normalizing seeking mental health support?
I would say that's the population that I work with. I work with young men mostly. We hardly ever get females, so I work with young boys and young adults. And the big thing is, don't cry, that you don't want people to see you cry and stuff, especially if you have things going on with you. It's been that's how they're raised, to you be tough, and all of that. So because they're raised that way, you hardly ever see them talk about it. So we're doing what we call restorative justice circles at work. And that's kind of now getting people an opportunity to be able to talk a little bit more about the trauma that they face. All of those type of things come up in these circles. So I think we're doing a better job now in getting them to talk a little bit more about their mental health and wanting to ask those questions and seek out the help that they need to, because they have a lot of kids that are on medication, depressed and all of that when they come out of corrections. So we're working a lot more with bringing in trainers too when they come to the office. We have specific, I think it's DBT or something like that, counselors that now work with these kids to kind of help them with that trauma that they face. So I think we're getting a little bit better in that area. I don't know if anybody else has something to add, but I think we're doing a lot better in that.
I would just
I
jump
think,
in.
oh, sorry, Matt.
Oh, go ahead,
You
Anne.
first.
Okay, I'll go. I was just going to add, when we were talking about children and things like that, one thing that I wanted to add was that access to mental health care is just so different. It's not like traditional. What I see with young people is most of the young people that I see, I actually don't see being referred into my office and through traditional means. We do a lot of counseling in the school. Like we have contracts with school districts where we're going into the school and seeing them during the school day. And one thing that on the topic of men's mental health is like, it's really important to see other men in this field and talking about their feelings and talking about mental health. And so we're kind of lucky that the program that I'm a part of, they're basically in my community, I can count like on my hand how many men therapists there are in our community. But the program that I'm a part of in the school district, both of the therapists that go are both men. And so it's just really important to again, representation, having men there talking about mental health and kind of taking it seriously. But there's a lot of really great organizations out there doing work, meeting young boys and men where they're at too. Like, it's not just about getting men into a therapy session. That's a lot harder to do than, having, there's a group locally that does like a midnight basketball thing where they get together and play basketball and then they talk. There's just lots of different things like that, meeting young men where they're at, as opposed to trying them get into a session. There is still a lot of stigma attached with going into a one-on-one therapy session and talking about your feelings. So.
Yeah, and even just throwing in another organization that I've been a part of. It's a South Asian organization, but it's geared towards, it started off with men's mental health, brown man therapy, but I think it applies to everyone. So if you're seeking out, that's another added resource that we'll put in there too.
Another way we work towards mental health in our community, especially for our male teens, is to think outside of the box and how we can get education to the people working with them. So in one of the school districts, we delivered mental health first aid for youth to all of the coaching staff. So the football coaches, the wrestling coaches, the basketball coaches. So that way they're seeing the signs and symptoms and they don't think it's just bad behavior or this kid just doesn't want to play anymore, that when they see these things, they know how to work through it.
Absolutely. And I can add on to that real quick. So now in my current role, I'm a university professor. And so I teach both graduate and undergraduate students. And so the undergraduates have been really fun to work with. So it's like, I actually see them as more like extended adolescence period. And so again, if there's a male student, right, who is expressed to me that they're having some sort of mental health stuff, I really lean into that, right? Because again, and I also give them, you know, praise, recognition, like validate what's happening, but also the fact that they feel safe, right? And so if they're trusting me with like, oh, I'm having, you know, performance anxiety before presentations, you know, working with them. So again, I don't slip into the role of therapist, but as an educator and teacher, like I said, just validating their feelings and just kind of also praising the fact that thank you for sharing, right? Thank you for being brave and courageous to share. And I would say not just with male, you know, cisgender males, but as we talk about any of the marginalized or minoritized communities, you know, so for someone who is South Asian or Black or Latinx, you know, because there is such a cultural or historical stigma or taboo about talking about anything mental health related, as we've all been talking about. I think if someone is brave enough to share whatever they're feeling or experiencing, being able to validate and support that can be really helpful. So whether you're, you know, an adult, parent, teacher, counselor, healthcare professional, or a peer or a friend.
And all of you, I'd like to add that in there, representing all of our communities. And because I truly do believe that when you see someone that looks like you're representing you, is speaking from the community, that means so much more. And also someone that can understand you. Also, maybe even seeing like a therapist from like your background too. And is it easier to have those conversations with versus having to explain everything to someone that's not from your culture? And those are often a lot of challenges too that I've heard. But I do want to share a comment that someone had made recently of like being the idea of having restorative justice circles, and that they feel that it would be extremely beneficial. So I do agree with that. And I just wanted to highlight that. And kind of like segueing in. Sorry, Tammy, did you have something?
I just wanted to add one thing. Earlier, a few months ago, we had Luma come out to do some training. I had Luma to come out to do some training with my staff, and they still talk about that training and how helpful it has been working with the youth and, you know, the young adults that we work with. All of the material that was left, we've been able to utilize that material to get it out, not only to the participants in our program, but also to their families as well. So we'll definitely appreciate Luma, and we're gonna have her back out here real soon to do some more training with my staff.
Luma's probably already tired of like all this work. We might need a Luma point two. No, but she is very great with trainings and programs and does a really wonderful job. So a special highlight to Luma, going out into the communities and sharing and providing that education. And if you can get trained by Luma through our Talk Saves Lives presentation or become a volunteer, I highly recommend it. So kind of go ahead, Uma.
Just to clarify, because in case people joined later before we did introductions, I am the programs manager for the Illinois chapter of AFSP, and we're talking about our proprietary programs. That's what, just putting.
Thanks, Uma. I always talk about Uma and all her work because I think she does a great job. Kind of following up with what we've already talked about, and since Dr. Pathy, you've already addressed this, and everyone has, but how can other individuals or caring adults or trusted adults in a child's life, like teachers, coaches, family members, therapists, whoever it might be, positively contribute to their mental health and wellness? And what are even like talking points if somebody doesn't know how to bring up that conversation? What are ways that you recommend like starting that off? Anyway.
Yeah, I can't remember if I answered it already. I think, and we say this a lot kind of in the AFSP world, but don't be afraid to ask the question. So if we're specifically talking about suicide or suicide prevention, like it's okay to ask directly, you know, are you having thoughts to harm yourself? Are you having thoughts to hurt yourself? It can be really helpful, like initiating the conversation if it's specifically about suicide or self-harm. And then, sorry, Dimple, I got a little confused. The other question is, what else can we do to help?
Yeah. In
today?
terms of like how can these individuals positively contribute, and you've talked about like ways of validating, but also communicating that to providing that safe space, but also parents. I know that's an area that can be a little bit difficult or challenging if there's parents who dismiss this. I've had individuals where like, I want to go to therapy, but my parents like don't believe in it or don't want to go to it, or like, you don't need, you'll be fine.
Yeah, so I think you bring up a great point. So I think sometimes making that bridge, and so again, sometimes it can go back and forth, right? Sometimes parents are the ones, or teachers are the first ones to realize, oh, that there's something going on with my kiddo, and so then they would bring the kids in. But as other people have mentioned too, access to healthcare, especially in certain communities, is so hard. So you may be on a 6-month waiting list or a year waiting list just to see a mental health care provider. So what often happens, and I learned this in my dissertation study, which I was so happy to do. I did the study in Philadelphia, and it was with children that had ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and their families. So I interviewed the families, and over 50% of the parents were Black women. And as they were talking about their experiences, they were like, we actually got a lot of our information from informal networks. And so kind of like word of mouth. So like, oh, if their, friend had a child, with ADHD and other mental health care concerns. So sometimes these informal communication networks can actually be really valuable too. So it's something, again, for those, some of us professionals, like that was something I learned. And that was really helpful to have community support, right? And I know Tammy mentioned faith-based organizations, communities can be huge. Any sort of other like community-facing organization, if kids go to an after-school program, right? Anything that kind of brings people together. Also, I think like a lot of folks we've talked a little about like knowledge and education. So also my dissertation study was so cool. So again, I got to interview 50, parents, mostly moms, and then they fill out surveys. And at the end, I had like a $40 gift card, Visa gift card, but I also created this like ADHD binder and resources. And these parents like literally were like, thank you so much for the gift card, right? And the money, right? But this binder, they literally like held the binder to the chest, right? And so for them, it was information. And so sometimes we don't realize, some information's at our fingertips, as we all know, with media, but getting, valid, correct information, especially when it comes to like medications for ADHD or other mental health conditions, right? There's a lot of stigma about the medications themselves. So really trying to find, sometimes it's like you have to find unique avenues, and for other people too, in terms of how do we help families or individuals get access to information and resources, especially when, again, having formal access to formal mental health care is difficult. And I'll pass it on to anyone else who also wants to share more.
I'm going to jump in not only as a parent, but as a mental health first aid instructor as well. And I think supporting our youth on the mental health journey, and you notice how I said journey, language is so important. We do not want to make a child feel like their mental health diagnosis is an issue or a concern or a problem. So language, how we talk to them is so important. We don't want to make them feel like they're in trouble, they're a bother. We just want to be there and support them and hear them. Use positive language, ask open-ended questions so that way we can get to the root of what they're feeling. And the biggest thing is like, okay, right now, what a crisis to me is not what a crisis is to someone else. So we have to think about when we have a 10-year-old, a 13-year-old talking to us about a friendship problem, a bad grade in school, that is a crisis to them. And we don't want to take away from them and take any validation away. We want to be like, I hear you and I see you and I know how upsetting that is. I hear you. We don't want to say, oh, well, when I was in school or when I had a breakup, because that just belittles their feelings and makes them feel unheard, not seen, not at the table, that I'm just supposed to be here and figure it out.
Thank you so much, Anne, and everyone for your responses. I want to segue this conversation into, as a little, like we have like a little bit more time to go until 8:30, but I want to also kind of transition into resources and support. And we've had a lot of great examples, and I just want to add a little bit more as we've identified and discussed like a variety of barriers. Variety of barriers and healthcare needs for marginalized communities, but really going into the resources and the support for these communities. And we'll share these. We have a big list that we've already created that we'll share out and keep adding to it. But what are some resources and solutions to address these barriers? Because there's oftentimes, especially even just within the Asian community too, of a higher dropout rate, either after the first session or less than 3 sessions, or not building that trust or that rapport within the first few sessions, or presenting to your primary care doctor with physical or somatic complaints, or, besides that too. So anybody want to jump in?
I can start with a couple suggestions. I think for immigrant communities at large, again, mental health is so stigmatized. A good resource is someone that's a good role model for them, because again, we don't have that understanding that mental health is a physical issue that we need to take care of. So having people who are speaking openly about their struggles with mental health, about getting access to therapies. I'll use I often talk about me and my mother as an example. I struggle with depression and severe anxiety, especially postpartum after having my children. And my mom watched me go through all of these, a couple different mental breakdowns, ER visits, lots of different things. But she also saw me going to therapy, getting on medication. And then most recently, a couple years ago, she lost her father, and she was my grandfather, and she was struggling a lot mentally. She was talking to me about lots of things, which is great. At least, she had the awareness that we can have these conversations, but she didn't know that she was struggling in that way. And so I had a conversation with her and I said, hey, I really think that you should see a healthcare provider. And you would think, end of story, she listened to me, she went to go see a therapist, right? Well, no, she was like, I'm going to go talk to your sister about this, and I'm going to tell her that you told me that I'm crazy. Because that's how they think, right? That's our general thought process. And so instead, what happened is, I went back to her again and I said, well, actually, how would I think that of you when you saw me going to therapy and getting treatment, and you saw what it did for my mental health? And that really kind of turned it for her to say, you know what, you're right. You're doing so much better now. Everything's managed. You know what to do. You've talked about your experience with us, and you've been really open about it. So that's been fantastic for my family, and but most importantly for her. So having key role models within our communities that can talk about mental health issues, especially also in a way that is understandable for them, that is relatable for them, right? Because sometimes, yeah, we can recommend a mental health therapist, but if you haven't been in our communities, you might not know that, we don't think that way, or we might have certain spiritual practices that might deter us from really leaning into any different types of therapies, or even leaning into medications, So, and we know that, that medication, that's that combination of medication and therapy that's been really successful for lots and lots of people. But that might be a barrier for some. Acknowledging it within, the medical industrial complex, within all of these medical health systems, that immigrant communities struggle with experiences of trauma and isolation and PTSD and depression, so that we can do more research to provide resources for them specifically. But that in and of itself, that recognition would be a valuable resource for those communities. And then also just more like, I guess more like quickly, something that would be a really great resource for people, especially for those who are already in a legal immigration process, is to make sure that legal representation has connection to counseling services for their clients. That way, if they do notice that there is something wrong or that there is going to be continued trauma or stress as part of their case, that they're getting access to the treatments that they need and going to those therapies. And then lastly, I'll add that education, en masse education about mental health is key for these communities. So whether that's, our Talk Saves Lives for Latinx community, bringing us into these spaces so we can talk to our communities about mental health care, or whether that's just general, strategic planning and communications and media communications about the importance of mental health care within our communities, that doesn't take away necessarily from that like spiritual or other practices and connections that immigrant and migrant communities might already have.
I just want to jump into and say thank you, Luma, so much for sharing. I truly do admire everything that you've done and putting your vulnerability out there, but also talking about like a lot of the work within immigrant families and communities, but a lot of different marginalized communities really starts at home. And I lost my mom to suicide in 2011, but also struggled with depression and anxiety myself. And I say, hey, I take meds, I see a therapist, and I go to therapy, and I struggle with like depression, anxiety, and I'm not quote unquote crazy. That the label that gets dropped on us, but like you said, I've been like working with my family for like 10 plus years, if not more. And like 2 years ago, it's like, oh, they started to notice something, or like if I wasn't feeling the best, but like it was that constant work, and it wasn't easy, but it's like putting in that effort and time of like having to educate, having to work with my family, utilizing language that they understand and examples. And it definitely like was helpful, but it was a long process in that. And I think that's a big part too of communicating that in there. And last other point too of like resources too. Understanding cultural dynamics is a big part, especially within Asian communities, the South Asian community too. The family dynamic, it's very the group needs are often put first over individual needs, versus in the American culture, it's more individual versus like the collective needs of the family. And that's also really important too when you're addressing this in the family dynamics and figuring out like what is appropriate or how much family involvement do you need to include or not. But that's also, I think, a really important part of like, yes, don't force it, but figuring out what works best.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Oh, so Cynthia and I went at the same time. Sorry, I work with a Cindy, so I say that a lot.
It's okay. I went by Cindy. But Luma and Dimple, thank you for sharing your stories too. And I was like laughing because again, my family also has its quirks. And so it just made me think about thinking outside the box, right? So again, and we talk again, because I'm a mental health professional, I'm an academic, right? So of course, yes, I talk about all these different types of therapies and different medications, right? And I've prescribed and done all that. But, also in the last few years, I've really kind of learned a lot more about integrative health, also like Eastern medicine. So I've leaned into more Eastern medicine. And also when we think about indigenous cultures, populations, like I said, and just like you said, finding people and communities and resources that resonate with that person, right? So again, it may not be traditional therapy that it might not work for people, or might not resonate with people. So my dad is from India. My mom's white and from America. My dad's been acculturated here for like 50 years, right? But several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, we were noticing a pattern. So we thought he had like seasonal affective disorder. Well, of course, we encouraged him, to see a mental health professional. That never happened. So we had to be creative, right? Our family. So he uses a seasonal light box, but we always just as a family kind of check on him and, things like that. So, I mean, he never sought mental health professional help, but we had to get creative. And so I think working with patients, families of any age, again, kind of trying to find that bridge, as everyone has been kind of talking about. So whatever it is that we think is going to help that person kind of move on, like Anne said, like their journey. I also love the word using a journey. I talk about recovery, healing, especially again, if you've experienced racial trauma or trauma based on gender, sexuality, immigrant status, all that stuff. It is a journey. And I think that if we can kind of continue to work with each other and support each other any way that we can.
Something I want to quickly share, I touched on earlier about finding your people. Working as a family liaison, I have the honor to go with families to these appointments. They don't have to go alone. I sit in IEP meetings, I sit in 504 meetings, request domain meetings, whatever it is they may need to do. And it's becoming more and more readily available. More people are getting trained to do it. And just look for those supports, especially through NAMI and FREDLA. There's lots of supports and we'll be able to get those things.
Sorry, I keep forgetting that I'm muted. So thank you so much. I wish we can get to all, there's so many more questions I want to ask all of you. I feel like I could stay here for hours, but I won't do that to you since it's already getting late. So we are towards the end of our panel discussion, but I feel like, a part 2 might be needed in 2025. So we might revisit that. But I want to kind of bring it all together and really address two of dismantling the barriers and discussing also like the next steps and a couple of solutions that we have come up with. And these are just brief and short ones. Feel free, panelists, to add into any of them I haven't added or you feel like we need to add in. But one that we've already talked about is really engaging the community-led education and campaigns, really that early intervention. And we've talked about the Talk Saves Lives presentation, the quick intro to suicide prevention, knowing signs, symptoms, talk, mood, behavior, really easy things that you can, like quick and easy ones that you can kind of point out. Or we also have our lifesaver cards for also Talk Saves Lives and for the LGBTQ plus community that are readily available. But going into that too of normalizing conversations about mental health issues and the care that we can help provide to help reduce the stigma. And I think, yes, it's going to be a lot. It's going to be a long time before, but we are making changes. We're providing these spaces and just really getting that awareness out there. And we are here, or AFSP.org, I think /Illinois, or well, yes, that's Illinois. There's a lot of support and resources, and I'll be sharing other ones that are on there. Great resources, but we'll share a little bit more, so you can reach out to us anytime. But also working with trusted community leaders and mental health advocates can also help shift that perspective and that narrative by creating and distributing culturally sensitive resources and materials with an understanding of those specific community-based beliefs. And that is also very important too, because yes, you can be Westernized, you can be Americanized, but also it could be dependent also on your family and how you were raised. And that also impacts a lot of it. And especially nowadays too, of is religion important to you? Is that an aspect we need to incorporate in or connect you with a faith-based therapist or somebody else within the community? But also going into adding individuals outside of these communities too can play a vital role as allies, as Beth mentioned too, in supporting and advocating for mental health resources and equity. But also there's that fear of, are we asking the right questions, or is my question not good enough, or am I going to get laughed at, or that fear of like, I don't know even what to ask. And we often come across that too. And I really want to highlight Anne and individuals like Anne who also go to these accommodation meetings and 504 meetings and IEPs, because it's really important for parents. And sometimes that they feel afraid to be able to even ask those questions or might not know what to ask. And so that's a big important part, but also implementing comprehensive strategies that really we've been honing in on is addressing cultural needs and the barriers to care. But that's also of having those trainings, but also culturally competent based therapists, but also, also connecting them with other resources if you might not be the best person and understanding those areas of need. But I also want to add into, as I mentioned earlier, but Tammy's mentioned this, Uma has as well, and a few others, of the strengths within communities with faith-based organizations and cultural events or organizations to support mental health, but also what initiatives are set in place and where can they go to access these supports. But also increasing funding for low cost or free mental health services to address these issues. Therapy is highly needed. And I cannot express how expensive it is, and figuring out where we can access those supports, or if somebody either that might not have insurance or has a high deductible or copay or anything, like what other resources can we provide in going into those areas. So and also expanding Medicaid and other public insurance programs to cover more mental health services, and it also can also help make a difference. But I think somebody had mentioned too of like the wait list, right? And getting into a therapist or even like practices that might accept those insurances. And so I do like, with changes in insurance happening, that might be an area that we might come across. So I want to turn it over to our panelists. If there's any other solutions or areas that you feel like are important that I haven't already addressed, please feel free to add that in.
I just want to add that we want to make sure that we foster those collaborations between community-based organizations, churches, schools, mental health professionals, and also we want to make sure that policymakers support sustainable mental health initiatives that are out there. And then last, we can advocate for policy changes to increase funding for mental health services by contacting our elected officials and participating in advocacy campaigns and supporting organizations that prioritize mental health care. So I just wanted to make sure that we add that in there, because those are where we get the dollars from that could help us do what we need to do when it comes to mental health. So I just wanted to make sure that I added that.
Thank you, Tammy. And one of the reasons too that I'm so excited to be part of this board is it is advocacy work. So AFSP is a huge organization that does tons of education, advocacy, policy work. I was kind of just like in my bubble of healthcare and academia, and I was like, I need to get out of this, So, I mean, again, I love that world too, but it's just so exciting. And just like Tammy said, like the big sweeping changes that we need to make, we can have a lot of grassroots efforts. But we also need funding. We also need policymakers. We also need legislative branches to be doing this work with us. And like you said, the community can be such a strong advocate. And so I also wanted to say thank you, Tammy, for bringing that up, because that's an area I'm interested in as well. And then I think just two things I also want to leave with, that we've been talking a lot about faith-based communities, which again, for some individuals can be, like life-saving, but also kind of coming back to the LGBT plus community. So on the other hand, the faith-based communities have actually been some of the ones that have harmed them with certain aspects of faith and religion, and how that can intersect with gender and sexuality. We also want to make sure that there's safe places that folks can go. So I know the Trevor Project, if we haven't brought that up, that'll be sent out in the resources. That's great for LGBTQ folks. And I guess the last thing I'll just end on is that really just having hope that things can get better. I think especially for communities that have been disenfranchised, like under-resourced, and again, have experienced like cumulative trauma over generation after generation, especially here in the United States, around the world. It can feel really daunting, especially in this political climate, social political climate, as Matt mentioned, but there is hope out there. And I feel like there are people that want to see things improve, like all of you on the line. And there's all of us who are dedicated to this work to support mental health and also suicide prevention. So just encourage everyone to have hope, even those dark days, having a sliver of hope to help move us forward.
And just a last moment of, I apologize. 988, you can always reach out 24/7, 365 days a year. If it's Christmas and you're feeling down and you need some support, families cross the boundaries and it hasn't been a good day, you call. There's someone there, they're going to answer, they're going to be there, hear you, and be there to support you.
And they're also available in multiple languages.
Thank you guys so much. And we will be sending out a lot of this information, so please don't worry. And if there are, we'll also, if you go to our website too, you can get in touch with Angela and Luma, and they can always connect you with the information that you might need, or if you want to become a volunteer or even get trained in any of our programs. We're more than happy to bring you guys on board. But I also have one question I wanted to end with if, oh my God, now I can't talk anymore, but I wanted to end with is by one of our participants, what steps can youth take to get mental health support if they were prevented by family or their culture from seeking traditional therapy? I know we've talked about 988, but are there any other resources or support ways that they can get support? And can these resources also be used by adults who are worried about others knowing that they are getting help? And quickly with that too, and just to jump in with 988 too, I think you mentioned this, but anyone can call too, right? Like a parent, friend, or somebody, or a text or call of like, hey, I'm worried about somebody. What do I do? What steps do I do? So
Yep.
it's not just for individuals struggling. It's open to anyone, right?
Yeah, we take third-party calls. In the past, I've talked to teachers, I've talked to coworkers, parents, aunts, uncles. Sometimes we work out a three-way call and they call the person from their phone. So and we ended up all three getting on the phone and working together. So there's lots of opportunities there. It's not just to the person in crisis. And I'm going to let Matt go now.
Sorry, I was just going to say, as far as young people accessing services, one thing that I know is in the state of Illinois, children 12 and older can receive mental health care services. I believe it's 8 90-minute sessions, and then that's evaluated if the need is for more. They can receive services without parental consent. And so a lot of organizations, I know that I worked in sexual abuse, that sexual abuse services can be provided in the same way. So children can seek their own services if they're 12 and older without parental consent if that's necessary, if safety is considered an issue or things like that.
Can you add that to the resource list, please?
Sure, yeah.
And just
Sorry.
oh yeah, and the person that answered it was a very complex question. So thank you for asking that in the audience. And so it's a difficult question to answer, but I also think a lot of us have talked about modeling. And so whether it's like ourselves, we've needed mental health support, our family members, other people, kind of being a model to saying like seeking mental health care is not a weakness, right? It's a strength, kind of breaking that stigma. And so there may be some times where you might not be able to share with your family if you've decided, hey, I need to go seek mental health on my own. But that doesn't mean that you can't come back around and share with your family after. If that answered your question a little bit. Like I said, we want to keep the bridge of like line of communication open between family members, but we also want people to get the care that they need. So if family is going to be a barrier, then people might want to move forward and trying to seek help if they need to.
Adding like transitioning right into that of like my experience. I share this a lot too of, I don't blame my parents or like how my mom responded to this or anything, because I go back to that generational cycle and that pattern of what their parents taught them and so on and breaking that cycle. And so I knew that at DePaul University, there was like a counseling service department, but I didn't know what it was about, but I knew that it was there. And so I did the 15-minute drop-in sessions. I was struggling with anxiety really bad that I couldn't eat. So I would eat in there and stuff. And then they're like, do you want to do an intake? I'm like, you know what? Okay, maybe fine. And I did. And it was affordable. Yes, there was the limit of sessions. I don't know how many there are now, but at the university level, there were at least 20 sessions at $5 a cost. So I say I went to therapy in secret, but it truly changed my life. As cliche as it sounds, that I'm now a therapist, but I was able to utilize those services in those times of need and without like my parents knowing because of that stigma and that shame. But I knew that something was wrong and I needed to seek support. So I always look into the health departments, or there might be a wait list too, but also of like any university settings or community school, colleges or universities, look into what they provide as well, because there's low cost or if not free services, either limited or unlimited on there. So any other questions do we have? We are just about time. Good. We made it through all of it. Yeah, we made it through. Good job, everyone. I thank you so much again for everybody that's joined. With the later resources too, we will be including all of that in there with all of these links. And if there is something that you cannot find or you have a question on it, feel free to email. I'll put my email in there and I can always connect you with someone that can help, or sorry, there we go. Someone that can help and get you connected, or at least get that conversation rolling if that support is there. But yes, please utilize 988. The support is there. There's a lot of resources from AFSP with how to talk to someone, what like language to use, how to bring it up. So there's really great examples on there. So thank you again for spending your evening with us, and thank you again from AFSP Illinois and our DEI committee.